Welcome to Laboratory Medical Update. I'm Dr. Mark Schauss, and joining me today is Dr. Andrew Cutler. Dr. Cutler received his Bachelor of Science in Physics from the University of California and his PhD in Chemistry from Princeton University. He is a patent agent and professional engineer. His research experience covered everything from alternative energy to space manufacturing prior to him becoming involved in healthcare. He's written 2 books, Amalgam Illness, Diagnosis and Treatment, and Hair Test Interpretation, Finding Hidden Toxicities, both of which can be found at his website, www.noamalgam.com, or on Amazon. Welcome, Dr. Cutler.
Hi, thank you.
Okay, let's get started. Dr. Cutler, the issue of the link or lack thereof between thimerosal and vaccines and autism has had a lot of media attention recently. The authors of a number of studies have claimed that there was no link between the two. Care to comment?
Many other studies show a link. The most recent example is DeSoto and Hitler in the Journal of Child Neurology, November 2007, showing that data on blood mercury and diagnosis of autism conclusively proves mercury causes autism. Also, medicine has basically become a liberal art. And if you look at places like the University of Washington Medical School webpage, they very clearly state they do not want technical people. They want liberal arts majors. This leads to a lot of the people doing the research simply being incapable of doing research on dangerous chemicals and their effects on human beings. It's not the kind of thing you would expect a liberal arts major to know how to do. You wouldn't really expect them to know how to use statistics right, understand what the statistics mean. So if you actually read a lot of these papers, the abstracts and conclusions just don't follow from the data.
Another important question I have is how can there be journal papers on both sides of an issue, like this especially?
It's actually very easy. Research is what you do when you don't know what you're doing. Most physicians really haven't had that experience. PhDs get to go through it. Also, when I was doing my dissertation research, I, like most of my buddies, redid the experiments about 10 times and figured out what we did wrong the first 9 and hoped to God we did it right the 10th time. Generally, in human subject research, you only get one bite at the apple for ethical reasons, and it's very, very easy to end up with a data set that seems really nice, but if you really went through it, it just isn't what happened. It just doesn't hang together. There was some systematic error. And then people take these data sets that may or may not have meaning and beat them to death with statistical tools, but statistical tools only deal with random error in your measurements and in your sample size. They don't deal with the systematic error of, did you recruit from the wrong group? Did you have the bad luck that the people you picked for the control group just happened to be atypical of the control population? Things like that. And then you also have, the liberal arts problem of the paper. DeSoto that I mentioned was some psychologists who did actually know statistics, who read the original paper by Ip Wong et al., which was in 2004, which claimed that they'd proven that mercury doesn't cause autism. And in fact, they had misreported their data and then miscalculated statistics from their reported data and just had wrong numbers in the paper. And the psychologists were enough of non-liberal arts majors to recalculate the numbers and realize the paper couldn't be right. The conclusions didn't follow from the data. Contacted the authors, and I don't want anybody to think I'm being critical of it and Wong, because unlike most authors in this area whom I've often contacted, they didn't just blow off the contact and say, oh, we published it, jump in a lake. They were like, oh, yes, of course, we'll provide our data to anybody so they can verify our research. And they found out basically there were typos. They recalculated the results and then discussed what the original numbers as reported meant, what the actual results were. And the results have been one of the papers that's very widely cited as showing that mercury does not cause autism actually showed it did, and people just didn't read it carefully. So what you have is a bunch of people playing blind man and the elephant, funding agencies, all of which have agendas, not just in medicine. In medicine, of course, you have the NIH, CDC, FDA, who, if it turns out thimerosal caused autism, they take a big political hit, so they want to fund people that find the contrary. But grant recipients in all areas, this was true when I was on contracts, know what they're supposed to prove. It's not unique to medicine. Most of them prove what they're supposed to. Sometimes the data supports it, sometimes it doesn't. In most areas, a 3-foot stack high of contradictory journal articles turns into a page or two in a textbook after the controversy dies down in a generation or two. In the meantime, one has to read the actual articles rather than just the abstracts, and also compare that to one's experience and that of reliable sources you personally know accurately report what they saw in order for you to decide which of these giant stack of journal papers to believe. Now, reading the journal papers is an art. You need a lot of technical background to really read their experimental section and their data and understand, does this hang together? Could this have really happened? Do I just ignore this paper? You can't figure out what they did. And based on that, the thing physicians are criticized the most for, relying on anecdotal evidence, is actually what they should be doing. Anecdotal evidence, the basis of all science. It's observation. I saw this. It's just like evidence in court. I saw this trumps somebody told me that they saw. Given this, we will probably see another 3 or 4 feet worth of journal articles appear arguing about whether or not thimerosal causes autism, even when at this point the proof is utterly conclusive that it does. And that's typical of the history of science and medicine. It takes a long time for these debates to settle down.
Great, yeah. Next question. Mercury toxicity seems to be a big focus of your research and writing. Why mercury, Dr. Cutler?
People get toxic with all kinds of things, and all the heavy metals are represented among the clinical cases that a doctor will see. Due to the combination of mercury's unique properties, choices to use it for certain medical and technological things, and a lack of understanding of individual variations of biochemistry, it is the most likely metal for people to get toxic with today. Also, due to what can only be characterized as irrational and scientific dogma in medical practice, people with mercury problems don't get diagnosed early, so they tend to get very sick before they present to the doctor who does diagnose them correctly. Also, of all the metals, mercury has the most variation in its possible clinical effects depending on the person's biochemistry. This not only makes diagnosis difficult, but also makes treatment challenging, since a very wide suite of interventions is needed to be able to control the various impairments one or another patient may be experiencing when mercury toxicity is the cause. Other relatively common toxins are lead and arsenic. Relatively uncommon ones are bismuth, beryllium, thallium, platinum. Someone in practice for a while will see them all. Toxins that people often get confused about are antimony and aluminum, which are frequently elevated in people with mercury toxicity but are seldom the primary toxin and clear out on their own once the mercury is taken care of.
Okay. Well, in your book, Hair Test Interpretation, Finding Hidden Toxicities, which I think all of our listeners should get at noamalgam.com, you talk about a statistical methodology that helps with the interpretation of hair tests from doctors' data called the counting rules. My question is, why do you have these rules? What are they? How do they work, and what do they tell us?
Mercury is unique among the toxic elements in causing a derangement of mineral transport across cell membranes for all of the elements. This means that in many people with mercury poisoning, their hair, blood, or urine levels of mercury will be normal or low. You can't just naively look at the mercury level and say whether someone's toxic. If you could, they'd all get treated by HMO doctors. The counting rules are a way to identify the derangement of mineral transport characteristic of mercury poisoning. They consist of a few simple rules for counting where the bars go on a hair test. For example, on a doctor's data hair elements test, if 5 or fewer of the bars in the essential elements section go to the right, that indicates a high probability of deranged mineral transport. Another rule is if 4 or more of the essential element bars go into red. And the most difficult rule is whether 11 or less of the essential element bars stay within the green plus white middle band. I always have to count this one rather than just eyeball it. How to do the counting is spelled out step by step with examples in my book on hair test interpretation. You can find out about the book at noamalgam.com/hairtestbook.html. When mineral transport is deranged due to mercury, then then the levels of other elements don't mean anything in and of themselves, though ratios still have their typical meanings. Thus, it's very common for people with mercury poisoning to be misdiagnosed with something else based on a naive interpretation of the hair test results. If all you had to do to interpret a hair test was look at what was high and low, there would be no need to train and license healthcare practitioners because anybody could do it. When mineral transport is orderly, then the other elements do mean something, and one should pay attention to very elevated values of anything that may be toxic. The book also discusses how to handle the situation where the hair test results are somewhat ambiguous. It gives a detailed discussion of what each mineral does in the body, what results on the hair test mean. For example, zinc and calcium tend to go up in hair when the body is deficient, and the signs and symptoms of excess and deficiency or of toxicity for all of the elements tested for. Laboratory tests are not some magic means of getting ultimate truth. They're just more information to add to what the healthcare provider can gather from history, physical exam, and clinical presentation. Since mercury is so easily confused with other problems due to its protein clinical presentation, the hair test is very helpful. Also, some toxicities can be quite similar. For example, people with copper versus mercury are almost indistinguishable, save that women usually have horrible PMS if they have copper, but less so with mercury. A hair test will distinguish copper from mercury from a mixed copper-mercury toxicity, and all of these are treated differently. Precisely because 39 elements are determined, the hair test is a great screening tool. It allows very quick rule-outs for diagnoses in situations where it is clear that there appears to be some sort of toxicity problem, or where it would take hours to sort out which one clinically, if it could be done at all. One of the situations where rule-outs are important is sudden onset illness with myriad symptoms, sometimes apparently consequent to an event like a motor vehicle accident. Some of these people have closed head injury, soft tissue injury, mild spinal injury. Others have toxicity that was subclinical until unmasked by the stress of the accident. Another situation, of course, is where the patient can't give a good history or discuss their symptoms, such as psychiatric illness or developmental disorders. It's important to remember the statistical definition of normal in lab tests. 1 person in 20 is high or low on any analyte. Thus, in interpreting a hair test with 39 analytes, you need to use some statistical approach like the counting rules to avoid inappropriate treatment of what are, in fact, normal results in some individuals.
Okay. Next, I understand that you often state that using urine challenges for testing heavy metal burden in people is inappropriate and should not be done routinely. Why is that?
Most important reason is it has no diagnostic utility. Nobody actually reads the literature on challenge tests. They just read the abstracts in PubMed. If you actually read the literature, you see dozens of people who were perfectly healthy, who had dramatically high scores compared to anything you ever see clinically in an alternative doctor's office. If you get challenge test results from normal, healthy, and toxic people, they are not well distinguished. You cannot say based on a number that those above this number are toxic, those below are not. And coupled with this lack of real diagnostic utility, all the popular challenge test protocols have very substantial risk. And there's no reason to accept risk and not get information back. So the only reason I think people should use challenge tests is when the insurance company will actually provide coverage if they have a challenge test result and won't otherwise. But it's not diagnostically useful. It has risks. There are lots of other ways to get more diagnostically useful information.
In your book, Amalgam Illness, which I also highly recommend, you lay out a mercury detoxification protocol that you're very adamant about. You call for low-dose use of alpha-lipoic acid and oral DMSA on an every 4-hour dosing schedule. Others have suggested that an every 8-hour schedule is easier and just as effective. Why your protocol over the other?
Because mine leads to the people getting better, and theirs leads to the people often becoming horribly, permanently, untreatably worse. And this is based on the fundamental laws of nature as they govern the properties of the chemicals you're using. It's not based on whether people like me or like the other people. It's not based on how big a stack of credentials we have. actually the most lucid presentation of exactly how to chelate is in the back of the hair test book. What amalgam illness covers that the hair test book doesn't is what to do for 9 million other symptoms. Hair test book is a very basic description of chelation, a few other things, lots of hair test examples. Alpha-lipoic acid is the most powerful chelator available. This is unfortunately not well discussed in the English language literature and requires some knowledge of chemistry or of ability to read the Russian language literature. And the kinetics of alpha-lipoic acid, DMSA, DMPS, very well established in human subjects, for DMSA in pediatric subjects. And if you look in any standard medical book like Goodman and Gilman's Pharmacologic Basics of Therapeutics or Harrison's Textbook of Internal Medicine or Getz Textbook of Neurology, you find discussion of how do you decide how often to give a drug. And the way you decide is you find out what its half-life is, and you give it about once every half-life. And the more fluctuations in drug level matter, the more rigidly you have to adhere to that. The less fluctuations in drug level matter, the more you can just pick dosing because it's convenient. So the basic pharmacologic properties of alpha-lipoic acid require it be given every 3 or 4 hours. Must be done that way. Doing it that way clears mercury from the internal organs and CNS. Giving it less frequently concentrates mercury into the internal organs and CNS. One of the things not well appreciated in medicine because of the lack of technical and quantitative study in favor of liberal arts study so that people will have a good bedside manner is the ability to do a mass balance and really appreciate, where all of the mercury is or bled or whatever in a toxic person. In fact, when you have somebody who has mercury poisoning, they have mercury throughout their body, and most of their body is not very sensitive to the effects of the mercury. So you have a situation where somebody may have 5 or 10 milligrams of mercury in them and only have 100 micrograms in the parts of their brain that are sensitive. If you give them alpha-lipoic acid or DMSA or DMPS on an inappropriate schedule, such as alpha-lipoic acid or DMSA 3 times a day or DMSA every other day or DMPS by monthly injection or every other day, you in fact enhance urinary excretion of mercury and clear a lot of it out of ligaments, connective tissue, the extracellular space, muscles, but concentrate it into the brain and liver. So you take a person and by moving the mercury around where it is in them, make them clinically much more toxic even while you reduce their overall body burden. In order to prevent that redistribution, you have to give the chelators every half-life or more often. For alpha-lipoic acid, that's every 3 or 4 hours. For DMSA, it's every 4 hours or so. For DMPS, it's every 8 hours. There's a little bit of individuality there. Every once in a while, you'll find someone who has a very hard time on that, and if you make the administration more frequent, they do better. If you make it less frequent, they do worse. That appears to be counterintuitive to physicians. Most of the people who say every 8 hours or 3 times a day say it for physician convenience rather than because they care about the patients. Because the physicians who don't really understand why you have to do this or who don't have a good bedside manner end up arguing with the patients for a long time about, yes, you really have to get up at night. And that's expensive because they can't really charge extra for this time arguing with people. But in fact, if the physician really understands you have to do it and learn some simple pattern, then the people do it and it's never an issue. The doctors I work with very routinely say something like, do you get up to pee at night? The people say, yeah. And they say, well, you're going to have to get up to do this too, but you don't even have to sit up. You just have a pill and a glass of water on your nightstand, swallow the pill, roll back over. No big deal. The people all do it. The things that are inflexible and dictated by the laws of nature is how often you have to give each chelator. It's a specific number for each chelator, and there is no intervention that changes that number. If you hear people claiming different half-lives for these things, then ignore everything those people say. They're so clueless they don't even know what half-life means. It's a fundamental law of nature what the half-life of that in a mammal is. The things that are flexible is exactly which chelator you use, how much of it you use, how often you use it, or how long a period of time you do these cycles for. It's every 3 hours, or every 4 hours, or every 8 hours. For how long? So empirically, it's been found if you go 3 days or longer, that people tend to do a lot better than if you go short cycles. It's, in theory, one could start from the morning, go to the evening, stop, repeat, skip the nighttime doses. In practice, the people who do that get very, very, very sick. In practice, the people who get up one morning, start, and don't stop until at least evening of day 3 do fine. And a lot of how long you take it and skip is really just empirical based on each person, how well they tolerate it. A lot of why I say to do it in these cycles of take it for a few days, skip, so on, is because almost all experience with chelators has been that way, and I don't think it's a great idea to innovatively change everything. It's like there's not a lot of human experience with continuous chelation. In cases where it seems to be indicated, such as when people feel much better on chelation, it's relieving symptoms, generally I have not heard problems from them doing that, but that's not a common kind of protocol in the literature and in clinical experience, so I don't recommend doing it routinely. As I said, the alpha-lipoic acid is what clears the brain and the organs. DMPS, DMSA only access the extracellular compartment. They're not effective in clearing the brain. They may relieve a lot of symptoms because a lot of symptoms are due to mercury in the rest of the body in a fairly toxic person. But to get full, complete relief, they got to use alpha-lipoic acid. Alpha-lipoic acid is the most effective chelator. It is not essential to use DMPS or DMSA, though it's very helpful often. If you have something other than mercury, you have to look at which chelator for which thing. So you may notice that I haven't mentioned the most common chelator of all, EDTA. That's because it's actually not helpful for mercury and often harmful. However, for other uses, it's fine. It's very helpful for vascular disease. But when you have someone with a mercury problem, you don't want to use it for the mercury problem, or otherwise if you can help it. If someone has lead, you want to use DMSA because DMPS is completely worthless for clearing lead. But DMPS is otherwise very helpful for everything else and generally gives the best subjective sensation. Also, it does have the convenience of 8-hour dosing. It's very important to remember timing is a law of nature. Every 8 hours is not 3 times a day. It's every 8 hours by the clock. Every 3 hours is not 8 times a day. Every 4 hours is not 6 times a day. It's every so many hours by the clock.
Having heard you say this, you talk mostly about oral chelators. Why not IV?
2 very good reasons. The first of which is oral absorption of all of these chelators is very good. There's no reason to inject them. The other is actually very interesting, is what you're trying to do by giving them frequently is prevent the blood concentration from going up and down too much. When you give them by mouth, they absorb over an hour or 2, and that necessarily spreads out the peak of absorption and prolongs the effective lifetime versus the theoretical half-life. And if you inject them, you get a very high peak in blood concentration right when they go in, and then it falls rapidly. And unless you want to inject them every 3, 4, 6, 8 hours, which nobody's going to want to do, then you also have the issue of not giving them frequently enough. So it's actually preferable that they be administered by mouth or transdermally if you want. There tends to be more adverse reactions there, instead of through a needle. And even people with very impaired digestion do very well taking them by mouth.
Okay, and finally, what other tests do you find helpful in working with mercury toxic individuals?
Aside from any tests that may be relevantly indicated, I find a complete blood count with differential is the most likely to be informative. Very, very common issues with either iron deficiency anemia or methylation anemia. Sometimes other issues, sometimes a little bit of neutropenia. Ferritin is pretty useful. I suggest in men who complain of any kind of achiness, lethargy, lack of drive and motivation, check testosterone levels, compare them to age-appropriate norms, not to the lab norms that are usually for 85-year-old men. In women, their hormones are almost always messed up. Reasonable female hormone panel, anything reasonable to help the hormones be in balance makes it feel much better. It's relatively common that people have thyroid axis derangement, so a free T3, free T4 TSH is real helpful. If they don't want the free T3, free T4, then T3, T4 TSH. Serum uric acid is very, very helpful. It tends to go low with most heavy metals, but high with lead. So when you have someone with mercury, you'll typically see it below 4. They'll feel a lot better if you give them a bunch of molybdenum. If they have some lead, you'll see it up above 6. May not be frankly high, but then you don't want to give them molybdenum, and you want to suspect lead and make sure to use DMSA. The standard chem panel, SMA-28, stuff like that, I find so seldom useful that I really encourage people not to bother. But for historical reasons, physicians almost all order those. Other than that, the testing tends to be really very much on indication. My experience has been that physicians, having a realistic view of the ambiguity of their clinical skills, tend to rely on the laboratory too heavily because they don't have a realistic appreciation for how often the laboratory can goof and how little laboratory results can mean. So I spend a lot of time encouraging physicians to rely on their clinical skills, and when they see something clinically that contradicts the lab test, believe what they're seeing. However, aside from the hair test, which I think is just a marvelous place to start, great screening tool. Remember, you can't use it on permed or dyed hair, or you can alienate people with long hair by insisting on following the lab instructions and snipping it close to the scalp. You can use distal hair if it's not permed or dyed. You just have to remember to account for when it was grown. You can use pubic hair. Pubic hair works fine. I've seen lots of pubic hair tests. They come out just the same as head hair tests. I haven't seen enough axillary hair tests to know whether or not those work the same, but I would expect them to. But otherwise, it's really very straightforward, simple stuff. CBC, thyroid test, serum uric acid, hormone panel is indicated. If you have like thin, anxious people, then a hemoglobin A1C where you're looking whether it's low is helpful to determine if they really are getting pretty close to the edge of adrenal insufficiency. But when you have thin, anxious, self-involved people, you don't really need the test to know that they need adrenal support.
I just thought of one other question that I think our listeners would be real interested in, the issue of urinary porphyrins and mercury.
It's truly an interesting issue. It's one I'm very aware of. It's one that has some very fascinating literature. So I'll give you kind of a long answer, but I'll start with the short answer and then chase it around. The short answer is very limited clinical utility because of the very high rate of false negatives. And that flows from the fact that in a laboratory test, the real chain of analysis starts while the urine's still in the urethra. Once it comes out and is a free stream in the air, the lab test started. And from that point until the final measurements is made, everything can affect the results. Now, for most things like a reflex urinalysis, blood in urine, whatever, it really doesn't matter very much until it gets to the lab. The problem is that porphyrins are very, very sensitive to air oxidation and to light oxidation, photooxidation. So if you pee into a bucket in a room with fluorescent light, by the time you get the container and pour it into the collection container in the refrigerator, half the analyte's gone. And that's not under the laboratory's control. There's nothing they can do about that. There's no way they can check. They can't know that happened. If you bring it to a laboratory and the technician hasn't done the test before, they're supposed to make sure the urine's well mixed. If they shake the container instead of gently rock it back and forth, shaking it can destroy half the analyte. If they do this in a room with fluorescent lighting, that can destroy another half the analyte. So you can be sitting there with someone who has a very high level and shows up with a perfectly normal test, and that's not uncommon. So it's a really useful test if you always have this very great suspicion that normal results, even repeated normal results, can be incorrect. They can be false normals. It's like false positives and false negatives. This is simply a test with a dramatically high false negative rate. You have the work of Woods et al. On the 5-carboxyporphyrin being specific to mercury. That's now a test done at Laboratoire Philippe Auguste in France. That presumably this is a relevant test. Presumably this is specific for mercury. It's not clear to me what their reference ranges actually mean, which raises some questions. However, as a more general rule, all the mainstream laboratories have always offered fractionated urine porphyrins. And if you look at those, well, they're not specific for mercury. If you get elevation of coproporphyrin, then there's a rare genetic porphyria you can easily rule out, or it's toxic porphyria. If you get elevation of uroporphyrin and coproporphyrin, then it can only be toxic porphyria. There's about 4 diseases that are easily ruled out that can cause it, plus maybe 30, 40 toxins, and most of them are heavy metals. So if you use that test and found toxic porphyria, you have a very short rule-out list, and you can get there pretty quickly. The problem is you can't use it diagnostically or for rule-out or for screening because of the very high false negative rate. And I have a lot of discussion in the book Amalgam Illness about if people want to do this test, what you have to do for sample handling and how to try to wheedle the laboratory into it. The best thing is really for the physician to take personal responsibility to learn how to do this himself, and then teach every patient and write orders for the laboratory to give them all the stuff and have the patient themselves prepare the sample. Even with that, you'll get some false negatives. It does lead to one of the most, if you do like whole blood porphyrins, a lot of these people will show slightly high in those, who will also show toxic porphyria in urine. You just don't really get the fractionation of the whole blood porphyrins as a common lab test. If you're worried about a genetic porphyria, the important thing to remember is genetic porphyrias, typically the elevations are 10 times the upper normal limit or higher. And typically the people are very symptomatic episodically and do pretty well in between and have very well understood triggers. In toxic porphyria, you're usually seeing 2, 3, 4 times the upper normal limit all the time. Every time you test, it doesn't go up and down. Symptoms are not particularly episodic. The really interesting thing about this is if you look in the literature, you find I believe it's a Swiss study where they looked at urine porphyrin levels in children from birth through age 18. And what they saw is in the first 24 months, the porphyrin levels went up and down in lockstep with the amount of mercury in their vaccines. And they simply attributed that to natural variation and development, but it seems a lot more likely that's being driven by the vaccine-induced toxicity affecting the whole population. So, while it's a very useful test in some sense, it has pretty sharp clinical limitations due to the pretty high likelihood of getting back false negatives and getting very confused. And the doctors have to remember, and I'm sure most of them are aware, that if you start to use a lot of things like you tell the patient, oh, do this test, it might come back normal, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything, and then it comes back normal, the patient's going to say, well, this test proves I don't have mercury, even though it does no may be useful for the doctor, it can impair his ability to get that patient treated by having the patient say, all these tests don't mean anything, and I really don't have mercury because all these tests say that, even when, you knew there were a lot of false normals and that patient got one of them.
Well, Dr. Andrew Cutler, I'd like to thank you for sharing all the information you have today, and look forward to working with you in the future.
All right. Thank you very much.